Do you get stressed about the process of closing the sale? Well, you're not alone. And there's absolutely a way to ditch that sales anxiety for good. This video is going to introduce you to what's called micro-closing, which is an absolute game changer for B2B salespeople. Instead of one big, scary ask at the end of the sales process, you're going to sprinkle in these little micro-closes throughout your conversations. It's going to keep things smooth, it's going to identify concerns early on so you can deal with them, and it's going to skyrocket your conversion rate at each step of the sales process. So keep watching to learn the micro-closing framework that keeps deals coming through the door. Okay, first things first, let's break the ice with a super simple question that quite often closes the deal all in one fell swoop. You're going to ask, does it make sense to, and then the thing that you want to close? That is it. And the beauty is you can tweak the element that you want to close depending on what you're selling and where you are within the buyer's journey. And this isn't some fancy trickery here. It's just asking the right question at the right time. Let's say you're selling a new marketing software or tool that automates email campaigns. You explain the features, you show how it saves the buyer time, and your prospect seems interested. Here is where you then do the micro close. Okay, so knowing how much time this could save your team, does it make sense to get started with the free trial today? Do you see how that works? You're not asking for a massive commitment. You're just saying, hey, does it make sense to move that next step forward towards solving your problem? This way, the buyer isn't pressured to say yes or no to this big $100,000 contract. They're simply agreeing that moving forward to that next logical step kind of makes sense. I want you to do this throughout the entirety of the sales process. Your very first call with the buyer, you might say, okay, well, if we can solve this problem at the end of this call, would it make sense to book another one? That is your micro close. At the end of your sales demo, you might go, okay, well, if we get all this nailed in this demo and you agree that we can help in this 1, 2, or 3 ways, would it make sense to book a call with Julie tomorrow afternoon so we can run through the financials? Again, micro close. We're just micro closing the next step of the process rather than assuming the buyer knows what the next step is, which is dumb because you've sold this product hundreds of times. They may have never bought it before. So why would you rely on them to understand the buyer's journey? And you're also getting them to commit. People don't want to say that they're going to do something and then not do it. It makes them feel like a liar. It makes them feel gross. And so rather than one big commitment at the end, which puts a ton of pressure on the buyer, we're just going, okay, well, does it make sense to this? Yes. Does it make sense to do this? Yes. Does it make sense to do this? Which leads us then to the question, what happens if the buyer says no? Well, don't panic. We're going to cover how to deal with these sales objections and get the buyer back on track in the last step of this process, which we're going to call the loop. But for now, remember that this question is so powerful because, well, it takes away all the pressure off the buyer. They're expecting from you, they're literally expecting you to be an asshole. They're expecting some aggressive sales tactics. But if you're chill, you get collaboration from yourself and the buyer. It also reminds the prospect where they are in the buying process and suggests a clear next step. And that is super valuable for people who are unfamiliar with your product or service or how to implement it to get it purchased. And finally, it gets the buyer thinking logically about the benefits of moving forward rather than getting hung up on the potential risks or on the emotions of all of this. Because the goal here with these micro-closing is to keep the sales process conversational. It just flows, it flows, it flows, the buyer commits, everyone is happy, rather than this building of tension and stress and then a big closing question at the end of it. Now, importantly, don't overcomplicate this question. It is simple, but that's what makes it effective. All you're doing is working with the buyer together to see if they're ready for that next step. It builds trust, it builds rapport, and that goes a long way in sales. So next time you're worried about closing, ditch all the pressure, ditch any weird tricks or tactics or hacks you've seen on LinkedIn or you read in books from the 80s and 90s from the sales gurus back then. It doesn't work. Get rid of the pressure and ask the question, does it make sense to, and then the thing that you want to move forward towards? And I guarantee you're going to be surprised just how effective it can be. All right, so you did your first micro close. Amazing. You used the first question. But what happens if you don't hear the yes that you were hoping for? Well, first thing is don't panic. Remember, in this context, a no of does it make sense to do this? No, doesn't mean that the buyer is rejecting you completely. It means that they're simply saying that the timing to do that next step is not perfect, or they don't believe that that is the next correct step to move forward. And here is the beauty in all this. You can take that no and use it to your advantage. Think about it this way. You haven't asked the buyer, are you going to buy this today? Or is this a good fit for you? You've asked a much less loaded and just confrontational question. All you've said is, does it make sense to move forward with this? So a no is telling you that they're not ready for that specific step just yet. And this is where question B, the second question, comes in. And this is how you turn the majority of no's into a future success, as long as you ask this question and then genuinely follow up on it. So if you hear a no or any hesitation, you just ask, okay, well, what do we need to do to move this forward? So let me give you a more practical example here. You might ask, does it make sense to get started on revamping your website? The buyer turns around and says, I'm not quite there yet. We're still finalizing the budget for next quarter. So do you see that? They're not shutting you down completely. They're giving you some valuable information. And at this point, you hit them with question B. You're going to say, okay, I hear you. That sounds solvable. What would be a good next step to move things forward? And this is where the magic happens. The client themselves, the prospect, is going to tell you the logical next step. They might say something like, okay, well, once the budget is finalized, I'd love to see a more detailed proposal outlining these specific features. And there you go. They just handed you the next step. If you'd have tried to bully them one way or manipulate them another, then you'd have just pushed them back. Now they've told you the next logical step. All you've got to do is get confirmation that that is the next logical step, and then get it in the diary, get a meeting booked to confirm it, get it done, and then get the deal closed on the back of it. And that is it for micro-closing for most salespeople. Now, if you are a pro, if you want to take things to the next level, there are two ways that you can maximize the effectiveness of this second question. The first way to maximize the effectiveness is to structure the question with the acknowledgement next step formula. So you're going to acknowledge the buyer's hesitation and then ask them for input on the next step. So you might say, I understand, I hear what you're saying, budget is a key factor. What would be a good next step to explore this further? This then sets you up for a conversation where you can address their concerns and potentially get the deal done once you've dealt with the budget issues. And that is great at the top of the sales process when perhaps the buyer isn't as qualified as what you thought they were. Maybe they're not in the pain that you assumed that they were. Maybe your hypotheses were slightly off here. So we've qualified the buyer further, we've understood the next step, and then maybe we communicate with them at a later date to wrap things up. But then we also have buyers who are stalling or hesitating towards the end of the process. If you know that they have the budget, they're qualified, they're the right person, and of course they have the pain that you can solve, or they're trying to move towards the pleasure that you know you can deliver, then you can use the acknowledgement, social proof, and suggested next step formula for your second question. And this formula adds a layer of influence to this question. You're not bullying the prospect down a certain direction, but you're gently nudging them as to maybe this is the next step that might be useful for you. And whilst you're doing that, you're adding a layer of trust to the conversation so that the buyer is more likely to fall into your frame, your viewpoint, your expected next steps for them. So here's an example. You might say, I understand many companies are hesitant to invest in website upgrades up front. In fact, a company similar to yours wasn't either, but when they invested in a complete website redesign, they saw about a 20% increase in online leads. Perhaps me putting together a detailed proposal would be a good next step for you. So here we've done a bunch of subtle things, right? Social proof is the most important element here. We've tapped into the buyer's human desire to want to follow the crowd. By mentioning a success story, you're subtly nudging the buyer in the direction that you've outlined in the question. But remember, social proof, we need to use it strategically. We don't want to brag, we don't want to overdo it. That's going to come across as inauthentic. This has all got to be conversational throughout the entirety of the sales process. So focus on real customer experiences. If there's a trusted brand in your space that you've worked with, or even if it's a competitor of your organization that you've done good work for. So that is question B. It helps you navigate a no and turn it into a roadmap to getting that yes. By asking a question and allowing the buyer to tell you no without any consequence, and then following up with a question of, okay, well, either what do you think is the next step, or here is some social proof that this is the next step. You're showing that you're there to help the buyer. You're not pressuring them. And that builds massive amount of trust, again, as you do this throughout the entirety of the sales process. All right, so let's get into what I think is the coolest bit of this entire micro-closing process. So if you've ever felt stuck in a sales conversation, this is how you get out of it. And let me give you an example here of question A, question B, and then the loop itself between them. So if I'm closing a small business owner and they want to jump in Salesman.com Academy, but we're kind of moving towards the end of the process here and there's a bit of hesitation, I might say, okay, well, does it make sense to get signed up to Salesman.com Academy today? The buyer turns around and says, I'm not quite there yet. And I go, okay, well, when would it make sense to get signed up to Salesman.com Academy? And they go, well, I'd like to give it, a couple of days. I need to think about it over the weekend. So, and again, we loop back around. Well, would it make sense to book a quick call Monday morning so we can run through it? I can answer any questions you may have and we can get this over the line so I can start helping you find and close more deals in the next 30 days. And they go, oh, I'm kind of busy Monday morning. You go, no worries. You loop back around. Okay, well, would it make sense to book in a call Monday afternoon then? And you do this enough and you go deeper enough and you keep being persistent and assertive with your questioning. And eventually, 9 times out of 10, even more so than that, it's like 99 times out of 100, the buyer will give you the logical next step that they have in their mind. And the cool thing is when you ask a somewhat open-ended question B of what do you think is the next step? How would you like to move things forward? The buyer will give you options to succeed that you didn't know were even on the table. They might tell you that they need to get someone else involved. Procurement might need to sign off on something. They start the conversation wanting one thing, but now they want something else, which might even be more expensive and a bigger deal for you. All you got to do over and over and over again throughout the entirety of the sales process is question A, question B. If you don't get a resolution, loop, 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 loop until you do. And that is it. That is micro-closing. That is how simple it is. Your buyers will love this because they now know where they are in the buyer's journey. They know how many steps they've got left until they have their problem solved. And this is kind of cliche and like a bit corporate to say, right? But it makes the entire process collaborative. Rather than you being this, give me your money, it's now, how about this? How about this? You're still guiding the buyer towards the end goal, which is close, which is implementing your product or service, which is solving a problem. But you're doing it in a subtle way where they feel involved. And to really understand the power of the loop, here is what Tom Hopkins said on a recent Salesman.com podcast episode.
There are some people that have to say the no. And if in saying so, it's kind of almost like saying, we're close to saying yes, but give us a little more help.
So that is it for the micro-closing framework. If you want to continue making selling simple, why not click the video that's on the screen right now?